and good evening. It's really a pleasure for me to be here tonight. I'd also like to thank the deans, leadership, and faculty of the college for having me here tonight, and also acknowledge a colleague of mine, Kathy Kotorides, who's the executive director of Historic Boston Incorporated. Thank you for coming tonight. In light of the reception I understand that you had earlier tonight for prospective students, I imagine there might be a couple of prospective students here. And I wanted to share that while putting this talk together, I've been reminiscing about my decision 40 years ago regarding my architecture and design education. And in working with my high school counselor at that time and looking at architecture schools, I came across information about the Boston Architectural College and seriously considered coming here. I knew it was an interesting school, that it offered this unique relationship between studio, internship, and practice as a model for architectural education, but it just seemed a little too far away for a young high school student at that point in my life. Now, 30 years ago, 10 years after that, was my first visit to Boston, and I stopped by to look at the building and tour it a little bit, and actually lamented a bit that I didn't pursue that original thought of coming here. Now, although finally arriving in Boston 5 years ago via one of those other architecture schools across the river, I have always had a place in my heart for the BAC. So take that as a very positive endorsement. If you're considering an education here, I would wholly recommend it. And although it took me 40 years to finally arrive at the BAC, I am particularly honored and privileged to be here tonight. So thank you very much. Allow me to provide a little bit of context for my talk tonight. I was asked to give a talk because of the unique historic preservation model that Historic Boston Incorporated employs in the work of real estate redevelopment. As a nonprofit real estate developer with a mission to preserve and restore significant Boston buildings, HBI brings to the field of preservation a certain perspective and approach on the restoration and repurposing of historic buildings. But I think it's important to place the mission and work of HBI within a larger context that informs its perspective and approach in the field of the actors and the activities that are part of a larger economic development community. So I choose to place the work in the context of regenerating neighborhoods with cultural heritage. And I'll break that down a little bit as I go through the talk, so hopefully it'll start to make sense to you why I'm doing it this way. And so that you also understand a bit more of where I'm coming from. As Eleni pointed out, before joining Historic Boston in 2012, my practice as an architect and an urban designer in the Midwest had already developed into one that embraced inner city redevelopment strategies and that employed what I will term, or what I tend to term, surgically removing, skillfully inserting, and selectively restoring buildings that regenerate inner city neighborhoods with economically viable uses. So in effect, removing what is not of value, restoring what is, and adding new to reestablish that cohesive urban fabric and economically sustainable neighborhoods. And since the act of building within a city can rarely, if ever, be done in a vacuum, social, political, and economic aspects are the influencers, drivers, and structures within which the various actors of a city engage in that dance of urban redevelopment. So neighborhood regeneration, in my perspective, is about the leveraging of capital to reestablish long-term sustainability. So here's a bit of an outline of what I'm going to go through tonight. I'll give you the premise for what neighborhood regeneration is all about and how it relates to historic preservation and cultural heritage. I'll talk about the various forms of capital. I break it down into physical, economic, community, and cultural, and a little bit of political as well. And then I'll talk about the work of HBI and how it relates to all of that, mostly through the projects. A little bit of a disclaimer, because so much of this is beyond the work of HBI, and this was partially for Kathy's benefit. Not all of my views are the views of HBI. I think it's also important to understand what this talk is not about, because the field of historic preservation is very large, and it encompasses a lot of different ways of engaging that particular field. So it's not about a theory of historic preservation. It's not about a style or typology of buildings or what determines their historic significance. It's not about the listing functions of the National Register of Historic Places. It's not about the various standards and guidelines of the Secretary of Interior that are rich and engaging in and of themselves. And it's not about the entire field of historic tax credits, of which I could speak for a long time about, and which actually I find quite fascinating. But it's not about that, or about evaluating those elements of a building to preserve, rehabilitate, or restore a particular structure. And it's also not about preserving buildings as museums or set pieces. A noble and honorable act is a part of historic preservation, but the work of HBI and my interests in urban redevelopment do not address those kinds of components of historic preservation. So it's also not about advocacy or activism, again, important in the larger field. So my premise is that historic preservation is more widely embraced and politically supported when it serves the community needs, and when it includes neighborhood and business district revitalization and economic development. And it's also, in my experience, a bit of that Jane Jacobs aspect of the revitalization of and the importance of these business districts and their relationship to their particular neighborhoods. There's an image of Little Italy in New York City around the turn of the last century, and I really love this image because it really shows the various components that make up of what we now call a sustainable neighborhood. It shows the convergence of capital and culture, of a healthy and vital neighborhood. Now, you need to ignore the fact that there is a little bit of overcrowding issue here, but it still addresses some of those important components that we want back in our neighborhoods, and particularly in the business districts. So it's the merchants, the mom and pop shops, the buying and selling of goods and services. It's where the leaders and the politicians and the elders of the community engage with their constituents. Culturally, these were, and still are, the social centers of the community. It's the cafes, the coffee houses, the markets, and the pubs. And these streets are the living rooms, the dining rooms, and the playgrounds of the neighborhood. They are also immigrant entry points from those other cultures that are engaged in American life, while still sharing, celebrating, and passing on their ethnic heritage, the food, the clothing, the traditions, and the customs. It's where people learn about the jobs that are available in the community, the news of the day, and where the youth learn about their heritage and how to actually socialize. So it's the buildings that establish the character and the context, and they form the space and establish the place that structures and supports what becomes the identity of a community. So I'll talk a little bit about the physical capital, the economic capital, and the community capital, those components that are the broader context of the capital. And I start with the macro aspects of a community. Boston is particularly interesting to me because it's often referred to as the city of neighborhoods. Neighborhood identity is a very deep-rooted aspect of Boston's identity. When you walk up to somebody on the street and say, "Where are you from?" In Boston, it's not just, "I'm from Boston." In Boston, it's, "I'm from Dorchester. I live in Roxbury. I live in the South End. I live in South Boston. I'm a Southie." That goes very deeply to the essence of the identity of the people. And that also, therefore, relates to their heritage, especially like from Southie, because it is also in their DNA. It is a part of who they are. It is an aspect of what's important in terms of how they relate in the world. And then as we go in closer and we look at the planning aspects of a particular area, we start to look at the social infrastructure, the civic buildings that relate to an area, the shopping and businesses of a particular area, all the different uses that need to come together in a blend and a working dynamic with each other, and all the influences of traffic and pedestrian access in and through a particular area, and the public open space. And we get a little bit tighter in and look at a particular block. And this is where we approach a project in that form or framework that I suggested earlier, which is the selectively removing that which is no longer viable and skillfully going in and rehabilitating and restoring the historic structures, oftentimes to their original use, especially in second-story development that might have gone vacant for quite a while. And then carefully inserting new to really bring that fabric of the city back into place for an economically sustainable neighborhood. So it's surveying those existing buildings, determining what can be saved, and believe it or not, from the work of HBI, there's very little that can't be saved. It just is a question of how much money do we spend on it and how valuable is it as a part of the historic identity of a particular neighborhood. So a little bit about the economic capital, just to focus on the shopping district typology, because there are distinctions, and what we're really talking about most typically are the neighborhood business districts. They are centered typically on the day-to-day convenience shopping needs of a neighborhood. They're the small stores, the markets. They sometimes include some national chains, coffee shops, and franchises that really contribute to the economic vitality of the entire neighborhood district. They are typically a part of a primary vehicular corridor. They are pedestrian-oriented, walkable. If they're truly successful, they have reliable and frequent transit, and they have a little bit of destination shopping, so they're drawing from the adjacent neighborhoods to contribute to the economy of that particular local neighborhood. They are often first-tier suburbs, so they have a history and a culture that's a part of the urbanization of the cities over time. And with that, they often have that heritage, that cultural identity, and we're often immigrant entry points. They are typically small footprint buildings and storefronts, and they are those mom and pop shops. They are essentially what is really termed micro-business enterprises, which is distinct from small business, because they generally have 5 or fewer employees and need less than $50,000 in capital financing needs. They're also often family-owned and managed, and they're sole proprietors, and they tend to be retail, food, craft, sometimes professional service-oriented. And it's the largest sector of businesses, so there is a large pool of businesses to draw from in economic redevelopment activities. It's about 95% of all businesses are actually micro-business enterprises. Again, those small mom and pop shops, everyday service-oriented, 10 or fewer employees, cafes, coffee houses, and pubs. And the finance mechanisms we draw from, I'm not going to go into detail here, I know that's a pretty dense slide, but it's really a large field of finance mechanisms that are complex, they're often challenging to fit and layer, but they do provide opportunity for economic redevelopment. It's the community development block grants, it's Section 8 loan guarantee programs that cities can employ, and low-income housing tax credits are another way that projects can be funded and financed that contribute to revitalization activities. It's also other departments at the federal level. Office of Community Services provides some funding mechanisms, as well as the small business enterprise, especially when we end up working with these micro-business enterprises to get them the capital that they do need so that they can be economically sustainable. And then EB5, which Boston hasn't quite yet taken to scale, but is beginning to make some inroads into this market, where it's supporting the creation of jobs in the community, but it also provides essentially visas for immigrant investors. And then there are different mechanisms such as community development financial institutions, which are organizations that can provide financing for both capital as well as business enterprises, and New Markets tax credits, which often flow through CDFIs, but provide dollar-for-dollar credits to investors in commercial development projects. And then what we employ at HBI in every one of our projects, federal historic tax credits. Both at the federal and in Massachusetts, we have a rehabilitation tax credit as well that we're able to take advantage of. And then it's engaging all of those actors within the various fields as partners in projects. The community development corporations that often are involved in low-income housing tax credit projects, but are also engaged in business economic development. They are the ones that have, not unlike HBI, or very much like HBI, have real estate development capabilities that they're able to employ in neighborhood revitalization, as well as the CDFIs that I mentioned earlier that provide not only finance, but also technical assistance to enterprises. And then the Main Street organizations around the city. Boston is particularly strong in Main Street organizations, and they are often partners in our projects. And then business district organizations that can provide a certain amount of promotion and beautification programs within their districts. And when they all work together, they can actually bring their various competencies and strengths together to effectively, along with colleges and the city, engage how to create sustainable, or the how-to on creating sustainable neighborhood business districts. And then community capital, those social networks, they're all too important as a part of the activities. The community activists and advocates, various civic organizations, the community planning groups, neighborhood associations, and as I said, the Main Street organizations, taking that capacity commitment and even the political clout that is necessary to effectively redevelop a particular location. And also the electeds, very important in the process, the city, state, and federal politicians at all levels of government. And then getting into cultural capital, and this is where I find it particularly interesting because I think it's not really addressed as effectively yet, but it's beginning to show up more and more in our neighborhood revitalization efforts. And that's tapping into that cultural ethnicity that provides the richness within our communities, the diversity within our communities. So it's the breadth of migration over the history of the United States, from the colonial period through the African slave trade, mid 19th century, and then the turn of the century, of last century, even up to more recent times, which is sometimes termed the new immigration period, where there are quite a few new ethnicities coming into our neighborhoods. So I want to step back a little bit and talk about the terms culture, ethnicity, and heritage as they really apply to the redevelopment of our neighborhoods. Because I use these terms, but they can be somewhat problematic because in some ways they are synonyms of each other, but they don't always actually embrace all aspects of each other. So culture can be high culture to low culture. It can relate to the fine arts and the humanities, but it also has come up more recently in planning relative to Richard Florida and the definitions around the creative class. And it's also used as a reference for group-oriented traditions and beliefs to denote a set of attitudes and values. Culture includes ethnicity, but ethnicity is not all-inclusive of culture, which is why I like using it. because there's a social cultural influence that is important as a part of redevelopment, and that includes all of the others, as Leonie Sandercock would suggest, the LGBT community, other religious communities, all of those other traditions that can influence and have an important component in the planning process of our neighborhoods. Ethnicity has also shifted a bit over the last few years as previous migrant groups have reclaimed their specific ethnic identity. So we get the hyphenation of Americanization. So you get African Americans, Asian Americans, European Americans, as everyone is reclaiming that ethnicity that, that speaks to their heritage and speaks to a core identity. But it's not all that new in the sense that ethnicity has affected the urban environment as we look at the ethnic towns across our cities. Often the Little Italies, the Chinatown, all of that, where various immigrant communities came into those areas as immigrant entry points and put their identity into the urban environment as they claimed urban space. And then heritage, which is typically used as a reference to a specific group of people that have a common language and inherited customs and traditions and practices from a past. It also is relevant to urban planning as a reference to historic design, the preservation of buildings and structures, and the artifacts within the built environment. So for me, culture and heritage are important to be used together because they broaden heritage from more than just traditions of a particular group that might have an ethnic relevance to a larger social cultural consideration. The Pew Center has predicted that non-Hispanic whites will become a minority by the year 2050. So diversity, ethnicity, heritage, the culture of all of our communities will have an effect on how we redevelop our cities. And this has actually resulted in an increased demand for ethnic specialty products, which goes to how we can reinvigorate neighborhood business districts with micro businesses. So trends in ethnic retailing, ethnic entrepreneurialism, and the magnitude of those micro-business enterprises, coupled with the rediscovery and realignment with heritage, means that there's economic development or economic opportunity in regenerating our neighborhoods and our neighborhood business districts. All right, now to the work of HBI. And I think you'll start to see how it relates to some of that initial premise that I used as a context. The mission of HBI is strengthening neighborhoods through historic preservation. And as Eleni mentioned, it was formed in 1960 by a group of Bostonians who saved an important cultural building and effectively saved the important cultural heritage of the city of Boston. This is now on the Freedom Trail. It's an important anchor building in the new literary cultural district. It's the place where Little Women was published. It's the place where a number of important literary pieces in our culture were published. And this group of Bostonians saved it from the wrecking ball. How important is that? How amazing is that we still have this piece of history as a part of our Boston experience? Very important. And if they hadn't had that foresight, it would have been lost. So the who, what, and why, and how of HBI. HBI is a nonprofit real estate developer, uses preservation as a revitalization and economic development tool, restores, repurposes, reuses historic properties. But most importantly, for economically viable uses, and we are often the developer of last resort. Many of the buildings that we save could not be saved by a for-profit market developer because we are able to access and raise funds from various foundations and private donors. And therefore we leverage the capital, all of the capital, community capital, political capital, social capital, economic capital of the community through partnerships and through multi-layered funding mechanisms. So into some of the projects. The Old Corner Bookstore was the original home of HBI and was up until HBI decided to venture a little bit out of the downtown and into the neighborhoods and purchased, or actually worked with the city in a lease program to redevelop what is Boston's oldest remaining firehouse structure. Designed by John Rollstone Hall in the Italianate style. It actually housed hand pumpers that were pulled by Torrent 6 firefighters, and you can see that's why Torrent 6 sign is actually was put back on the firehouse. It served with distinction in the Great Fire of 1868. It was the latter company was there between 1868 and 1873, and there was I think I missed an edit there. I think there was the fire of 1865 or something like 72. Thank you. And but from 1919 to 1950, it was actually just the home of the Spanish-American War veterans, but ended up vacant from the late 80s until HBI stepped in 2011. So you get some historic images of those hand pumpers that were pulled by the firemen. This is what it looked like when we started. And with project partners, City of Boston and Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation, otherwise known as MHIC, we've preserved a Boston landmark, reactivates a blighted and abandoned building, and creates new office space, not only for historic Boston, but for another nonprofit, Timothy Smith, who's on the first floor. And it also provided very important stewardship of the adjacent historic Elliott Burying Ground. A bit about the capital structure. The total investment was $2.5 million, of which 1.5 was the construction cost. The capital sources included, of course, historic tax credits, but also new market tax credits. And then important loans, CDBG loans from the City of Boston, and then fundraising of almost $550,000. The Hayden Building, built in 1875. Another building that was saved from the wrecking ball, designed by H.H. Richardson, and it's his only remaining commercial building in Boston. It's down in the Chinatown Theater District area. And first time I looked at this as an architect, I immediately realized that it was very likely a precedent study for Marshall Field's warehouse in Chicago, which is a part of every architect's history, and was an important building in Chicago in establishing skyscraper technology. And I've been reticent to say that, but I finally found a source that actually backed me up on that. So I'm like, okay, I'm feeling pretty good about this. It was purchased by HBI actually back in 1993, and $1 million was used to stabilize it. And I'll show you an interior in a moment, part of that structural stabilization. Oops. But with project partners, City of Boston, and with a host of campaign funders, it became a catalytic project for the Lower Washington renewal, and creates new housing. The upper 4 floors are residential, and it reactivates the ground floor into viable commercial use. There's an interior showing that structural stabilization. Steel X braces were used to stabilize the structure, and they actually then became a part of the interior design experience in 2012, 2013, when we finished up the project. So about $5.8 million of investment, almost $4 million was the construction cost, and the different finance mechanisms included historic tax credits. HBI was able to put some cash into this as a result of a recent sale of adjacent property, but that sale also is what has been used to do some additional development, which includes the next one, Alva Kittredge House, 1836. Built by Roxbury alderman, Elliot Churchdeacon Alva Kittredge, an important businessman in the Boston area, and built out in what was still somewhat the agrarian landscape. It was the suburbs of Boston at the time, now much more urbanized. And at some point in time, the left wing of the structure was removed, and the building was picked up and turned 90 degrees, and it now faces that street on the right. It was also once home to an important Boston architect, Nathaniel Bradley, and he put his mark on it, you'll see in a moment, in an interior shot. And it was, in the 70s and 80s, the home of the Roxbury Action Program. This is what it looked like when HBI took it over. So you can imagine that we're proud to take on great challenges, and this was quite a challenge. And that's what it looks like now. So with partners, City of Boston, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, Eastern Bank contributed to this as well, and a host of other funders and donors. It reactivates an abandoned and blighted property and supported other neighborhood redevelopment efforts adjacent to it and created some new housing. And so it's 5 residential units, 2 of which are affordable. And actually, a little bit of a side note, when we first started with the Proforma, we were looking at rents in the $1,600 per unit range, and I thought, I don't know if it's going to make it in Fort Hill. I was a bit nervous about that. You know, a year or so later, looked at the market again, and then I was looking at $1,800 a unit, and I thought, I don't know if it's going to make it, but you know, that's what the market's doing up there. By the time the project was finished, the first apartment rented for $2,300, the market rate units. So this has been a real success story, along with the success story of Fort Hill in its redevelopment strategies. But it's always about the larger community. It's always about the support that we're able to garner from a greater constituency. $3.6 million total development cost, almost $2.3 million in construction cost. It had a little bit more complicated finance structure. It also used the tax credits, but it had a host of donors, about $850,000 ultimately of foundations and private donors contributed to the redevelopment. The next one, the Vertullo building, which is a little bit closer to my heart, and I think you'll see why in a moment. It's likely the oldest and only surviving wood-framed commercial building in the Logan Square district. I think what I love about it is that it's not so historically significant, that it's really a vernacular example of Second Empire. It's rather simple, but it is one of the last remaining survivors within that district. Much of the rest of the buildings of that particular period of time have already been demolished. It is a very highly visible anchor to the community. You see in this image that when you drive down Fairmount Avenue, it has a very strong presence in the community. And most recently, we spoke to the Main Street organization and got some very positive feedback that what it looks like today is now attracting a lot of other businesses into the community. So it's having the impact that we wanted it to have. We did that with, again, the City of Boston, Hyde Park Main Street organization. Blue Hills Bank, in this case, was a contributor, as well as a host of funders in what we call our the Trilogy campaign. And this, I think, is what really excites me, because these are, this is a sampling of the 5 micro-business enterprise entrepreneurs that are now a part of our community, if you will. There's a barber, there are a couple of beauty-type shops, there's a seamstress who designs her own clothing, and she has a shop there. She actually was our first tenant as a part of the redevelopment. And then our last tenant is actually a little flower shop. So it is these micro-business enterprises. It is this ethnic retailing, cultural kind of redevelopment strategy that reflects the character of what Hyde Park neighborhood is now. $1.3 million in economic development, of which almost $600,000 is construction cost. This was not significant enough to go through federal tax credits, but it was able to garner state rehabilitation tax credits. City of Boston also contributed some CDBG funds for the storefront redevelopment, and the capital campaign, the Trilogy Fund I spoke about, contributed to the project. And then 3 projects that are currently in construction: Rosendale Village, Main Street area down in Rosendale is the MBTA substation that has been vacant since the early 70s, originally designed by Robert Peabody and Stone & Webster Engineering. It was a part of a larger system of substations that housed the equipment that converted AC to DC so that the trolley cars could go out even further, essentially a part of the suburbanization of Boston. And, but it stood vacant since the 70s. And in 2012, Rosendale Village Main Street, in partnership with HBI, received the tentative designation to develop the property. And at that time, the adjacent Higgins Funeral Home site became available for purchase. So we were able to take advantage of that, essentially facilitate the purchase of that property and offer that to a market developer, a for-profit developer, and incent them to come in, attract them to come in and take on the substation as a part of also getting to have the site for a larger housing project. So there are 43 housing units that wrap around in an L-shaped configuration, both sides of the substation. And you see that completed on the right. And they just this last summer started the construction on the facility. So they've opened up those monumental windows and that monumental door that actually faces a park. And so you can get a sense, the light's a little bit difficult here, but you can get a sense of this incredible volume within this building. It's almost cathedral-like when you walk in, and this exposed steel and the subway tile that goes up quite a distance on the sidewalls. And there is a gantry crane that spans that entire space that was used to move equipment in and out of that large monumental front door. And you'll see in a moment, it's going to be repurposed as a destination restaurant. And they're going to keep the gantry crane as a part of that interior aesthetic experience. There you see that. So it'll be a 125-seat destination restaurant. Total development cost, nearly $5 million, of which construction about $3.4 million. Historic tax credits, of course, and because we were able to attract a for-profit developer, they were able to leverage their investment base and bring $1.6 million to the project to make it work. And they continue to remind us they are not making any return on that, but we also know that the 43-unit residential building next to it, again, because of the market shifts that have recently happened, is going to more than offset the what they don't make on this particular project. And then the Fowler Clark Epstein Farm, currently in development down in Mattapan. It's one of the earliest intact examples of vernacular agrarian properties in Boston. So this is a really exciting property for us to work on, very different. We had to learn about urban farming because we're partnering with the Urban Farming Institute to use the facility as their headquarters. They also have other urban farming properties, so it's a bit of a satellite operation or a scattered site urban farming operation, but they'll be able to use this as a training facility and as an education facility and to hold conferences there. That's a little bit about the program of the site. You can see how the density of the property has encroached on the site over time. It was originally a 330-acre farm, and then the three families have engaged in the property in various ways. The Clarks built the house and the barn, and then the most recent owner, the Epsteins, did quite a bit of work on the property, inserted some interesting landscape elements that we are incorporating as a part of the preservation strategy. But you get kind of an overview. It will also include a new greenhouse on the back side of the property, and it will be an active urban farming operation. Again, it's about the people. We've had a couple events out there, and we're getting a lot of incredible support for this in the community. It's been blighted for a number of years, and they recognize that it has degraded their neighborhood, and its revitalization can really effectively improve the experience of their community. So again, it's the culture and heritage of people and place coming together. About a $3.2 million investment, and construction about $2 million of that, historic tax credits, and there is a significant fundraising effort, $1.5 million. But we're almost closing that gap. We're getting very close, and we're looking to have some construction activity yet this fall. The last project is a little comfort station. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a toilet building. There's another one in Boston. It's in the Common, and it's the Earl of Sandwich. This one happens to be in Upham's Corner. It's adjacent to the North Dorchester Burying Ground, which is on the National Register, so it's incorporated as a part of that. And mission style, it's a simple building, almost again another somewhat vernacular building, but it's rare. Mission style is not a common style within Boston. And it will be repurposed into the Sip and Spoke Bike Kitchen, which is a combination full-service bike repair and coffee shop. And it's not the first one, but they don't exist in Boston, and at least that I know of yet. And it will be an interesting contribution to the neighborhood business district. And we're always mindful of how it relates to the larger urban fabric relative to that planning work that I indicated earlier. Be about almost just shy of $1 million. Private donor stepped forward to contribute to this in a big way. It will get state tax credits. The City of Boston is also a partner. But there's more work to be done. So every building that's boarded up, every vacant, every blighted building is an opportunity for neighborhood revitalization. And as long as we have these, HBI is going to be very busy for years to come. All right, thank you very much.
Questions I'd like to ask Jeffrey?
Yes, in the beginning of the lecture, you addressed the point that sometimes you might have to remove the building. How do you determine what's insignificant and what is worthwhile saving? And the other part of the question is,
So I'll try and repeat the question. The first part had to do with how do you determine what to essentially remove that doesn't have significance, and in the evaluation of a historic property, how important is the facade in relation to other components, including the interior. So you open up a really rich and dynamic question, and you would probably get, if you had 10 different preservation people up here, you'd get maybe 10 different answers. So I'll attempt to weave together my personal approach plus a little bit about Historic Boston's approach. I would say it's very rare that one would remove a property unless it simply did not rise to a minimum level of significance. So this is the first part of your question. So if it didn't have any of the architectural previous owner significance, if it wasn't I can think of some small, overly damaged, heavily damaged properties that didn't meet any of those benchmarks. Those might be removed. But I've also been a part of saving even some of those. So it's a tough choice to make. And because HBI is able to access funds that other for-profit developers, we can typically save, again, as the developer of last resort, we can typically save things that the market wouldn't necessarily save. So that's about the best answer I can give you that kind of weaves my sense of things as well as Historic Boston's. The next question, the next part of that question having to do with its significance. And the minute you started asking that, I thought about some recent redevelopment that just saves facades. I mean, that immediately came to mind, which I think my stomach turns a little bit when I see that, because I see the historic value of a building as more than just the facade. To me, it goes beyond that. Yes, the facade is what we experience from the public side, but there's so much that goes into the overall design of a building. So from an architect's point of view, I don't see those as able to kind of piece them apart from each other. That said, there may be reasons why certain elements within a building just are not restorable for whatever reason. But I would be very cautious about going all the way to the point of just saving a facade and not giving more value to the structure, the spatial relationships inside, and many of the elements and materiality of the original structure. So I cringe. I mean, at some point, I wonder if when you remove all of that except the facade, is there really enough that's being saved? And especially if the redevelopment strategy completely changes the scale, if it becomes almost like a wallpaper entrance piece that has a tower behind it, I really struggle with that. Yes?
Is owning properties long-term a part of HBI's economic model?
We consider the work of HBI to be really a revolving fund. So everything could be revolved, could be sold and allow us to reclaim some capital to do the next project. That said, the Old Corner Bookstore is really a stabilizing aspect of our economic structure. It has no debt on it, so it provides the cash flow that's needed to support the operations of the organization. So that's a very important component of our work. And then within the historic tax credit structure, we have to keep a project for our building for at least 5 years during the compliance period. So we know that we're going to have a certain hold period on the properties. And then it's a question of the market. A property that is doing really well in terms of cash flow might actually help contribute to the growth of the organization. So it might be considered an important asset to hold on to. But there also might be other considerations in terms of reclaiming the capital to revolve into its next project. So each property is really looked at on its individual merits.
Out of curiosity, outside of the imminent threat of demolition and the revolving door that is finances, what are type of the rigors or the guidelines that you go through to select a building when it comes to the Fort Hill building?
Sure. So the question, and I think I forgot to mention the other one, but your question has to do with what's the thought process behind the projects that we select to take on. And to really answer that fully, I have to mention that over the history of the organization, HBI has been monitoring various properties throughout time. So all that you saw tonight that was completed, and even the two that are in development and are ready to go into construction, have been a part of what we call our commercial casebook. So the organization has done research on properties that were endangered. And so they came to HBI's attention through various networks that are in place. And HBI has been monitoring its ownership, whether it's time to step in and be a part of its preservation and repurposing long term. More recently, that casebook has been pretty much completed. So there aren't, either for-profit developers have taken on those projects that HBI was monitoring, or we have taken those on. So very recently, within this last year, we engaged in a business strategy process and started to identify various commercial districts around the city that had some of the opportunities that HBI looks for in terms of engaging with partnerships, and have begun to identify almost another list of properties that we think really are either underutilized or are ready to go through some kind of preservation process. And really looking at that neighborhood business district as the framework and the context for those next properties. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Do you think that having rental property, and especially rental residential property, it seems to me it's a positive influence on these kinds of communities as opposed to condominiums where, because of your continuous ownership and stewardship of the buildings, is that part of the strategy as well?
So the question is what's the effect of rental property in relation, or as opposed to condominium properties in relation to HBI being the steward of the property over time? It's not a direct a part of the work, but I would agree that it has value. Because we will be stewards of those properties for at least that compliance period for the tax credit work. And I think clearly the long-term ownership of the Old Corner Bookstore has had value for the community. That said, we also have other mechanisms that we can employ to help secure long-term preservation. We have an easement program which puts certain covenant restrictions on historic properties. And we actually manage certain easements of other properties throughout the Boston area where a property owner needs to work with us if they intend to do anything to that property. And they're required to maintain it at a certain minimum level. It's an annual review process. So all of our properties, the intent is that they will have, if they leave our ownership, they will have some form of preservation restriction on them so that they'll have that long-term stability. Yes?
Could you say a little bit about why some of your projects use both the federal and the state historic tax credits and some just the state?
Yes. Why do some of our projects have both federal and state, and others just have the state? And it has to do with their level of significance. We go through a process with the sorry, blanked a little bit. Kathy, help me. Massachusetts, yes. Thank you. I can't believe I blanked on that. The Historic Commission, Massachusetts Historic Commission. MHC, that, I was looking for the acronym. And we go through an evaluation process to determine their historic significance. And there's certain thresholds. They're either significant on an individual basis, based on architecture, based on who lived there, occupied the property, or other kinds of significant considerations. They could also be on the register, on the National Register, if they are part of an historic district. That requires a much more extensive process to get a district on the National Register. And so in the case of the Hyde Park building, it did not meet that minimum threshold. We actually tried to get it qualified as a part of a historic district, and they just couldn't get it to that level. But they were able to at least tell us that it's a building that would contribute to a potential historic district, and therefore the state was able to give us historic tax credits. Another reason why we might not employ federal tax credits doesn't have to do with its significance, because I think the Comfort Station would likely be able to utilize federal tax credits because it's really a part of the North Dorchester Burying Ground. But the challenge is that the transaction costs to actually do a federal historic tax credit project can be very high. They can be very expensive. The federal tax credit structure is different than the state. The state is actually an allocation of credits that a developer can either keep for themselves that reduces their tax liability, or they can sell those credits to someone else. And if they sell those credits, it's just a purchase and sale transaction. That buyer goes away and is able to use the tax credits. In the federal structure, the person that effectively is getting the tax credits is an investor, not a buyer. So they are actually the owner of a portion of either the property or a separate entity, which is the master tenant. And to put together the documentation of that kind of a structure is highly complex and requires multiple lawyers to be involved in the process. So for example, the Kittredge House, at one point at the conclusion of the closing of our federal tax credits, I actually sat back and counted the number of lawyers that we had involved in that process. And it added up to 13 before I added other associates of the different lawyers. So, and it was not uncommon to be on a phone call with 4 or 5 or 6 lawyers hashing out the language of the contracts and the operating agreements of all of the different entities. And the cost of that legal is on the developer. So the transaction costs just can be too much. So a small project just really can't support it.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thanks everyone, and thank you.
Absolutely.